Legends Swamp Thing has a new TV show. It's on the DC Universe app, and to be honest, I am pretty hyped. I'm a pretty big Swamp Thing fan, and I've been collecting his comics and appearances for years, so I'm pretty excited to be able to discuss with you Swamp Thing's comic book origins and his history. Now, this will not be everything the character has ever done in the comics, it's more of like my own greatest hits list, but if you're interested in Swamp Thing and his new TV show and you don't know anything about the character, this is an excellent place to start. Swamp Thing was created by famed duo Wein and Bernie Wrightson, and he made his first appearance in a standalone short story as part of a horror comic named House of Secrets. House of Secrets 92 was a standalone story that featured a turn-of-the-century tale of revenge. Linda and Damian Ridge are spending time in their home. Linda is recalling her previous husband and best friend of her current husband, scientist Alex Olson, who was killed in a lab explosion 12 months prior. We learn the root cause of the explosion was actually Damian, his best friend, tampering with Alex's lab equipment. We also learn that Alex did not die, and his body was disposed of in the swamp where he became Swamp Thing. Damian trusts that Linda is onto him and what really happened, and that she's putting together the pieces of finally understanding the fate that happened to her husband Alex. Damian decides he must kill her. He snaps, but right before he's able to enact his plan of revenge, Swamp Thing bursts into the room and chokes him to death. He then retreats into the swamp, never to be seen again, but don't forget about Alex Olson, we will talk about him later. Years later, the duo of Wein and Bernie Wrightson resurrect the character of Swamp Thing for a new comic series, and they alter the main protagonist. Starting in Swamp Thing number 1, we meet Alec and Linda Holland, renowned biologists working on the biorestorative formula. This formula is extremely important and very valuable because it would allow plants to grow in hostile environments, and it could even potentially end world hunger. But just like in the real world, where there's progress and scientific advancement, there is, of course, evil shithead corporations attempting to halt that progress and make money off of it. Local thugs working for a mysterious character named Mr. E start showing up at the lab and threatening the Hollands in their research. Alex seems to be pretty successful in chasing them off, but as thugs typically do, they come back, and boy do they come back with a vengeance. These two thugs named Bruno and Ferret come to Alec's lab and they knock him out. They then plant a bomb, and just as Alec wakes up, the bomb explodes, setting him on fire and drenching him in the biorestorative formula. This also forces him to retreat into the swamp in agony and terror. Linda holds a funeral for Alec and returns back to the lab only to be jumped again by the same thugs. Both Matt and Linda are knocked unconscious and the thugs attempt to flee, but this time they're met with a new adversary, Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing easily defeats the two thugs, but then retreats back into the swamp rather than be seen by his friends in the current shape that he's in. Also during this run, Swamp Thing is captured by a league of grotesque creatures known as the Unmen, working for the reclusive Anton Arcane, who's an old man/wizard who plans to use Swamp Thing's body to take revenge on the people who belittled him as a scientist. Anton uses a magic urn to swap bodies with Swamp Thing. The reason that he does that is because by doing that, Alec would get to be Alec again rather than Swamp Thing. However, when Alec deduces the plan that Anton has, he quickly swaps back, forcing Arcane to commit suicide. The rest of this series focused primarily on Swamp Thing establishing a stable cast of characters and a long-term nemesis in Arcane. The series introduces Alec's long-term love interest and niece of Anton Arcane, Abigail Arcane. Swamp Thing went on to take his revenge on Mr. E and the villainous group he represented known as the Conclave. However, it's Swamp Thing's second series, the Saga of Swamp Thing, that is quite possibly one of the best comic book runs of all time. The reason for this was due to the fact that Alan Moore picked up the series at issue 20. Moore's actual run didn't really begin until issue 21, as issue 20 was more of just Alan wrapping up the previous story arc for the writer that came before him. However, Moore's series focused on expanding Swamp Thing's mythos drastically. Moore's series drastically shifts our understanding of Swamp Thing, as a fairly large bombshell is dropped pretty early on. we learn essentially that Swamp Thing is not actually Alec Holland. What happened during the horrific act that created him was that the biorestorative formula merged Alec Holland's consciousness with the surrounding plant life of the swamp. Plant life bands together to form a humanoid being known as Swamp Thing, and this is kind of important to realize because prior to this, Swamp Thing always thought that he was Alec Holland just transformed into a creature, and that's not actually the case. The explosion killed him, and his consciousness was absorbed and bound together to become Swamp Thing, an avatar of the elemental force known as the Green. Alan Moore described Swamp Thing as a plant that thinks he is Alec Holland, which I think is also the best way to describe Swamp Thing. The second concept that Moore's run introduced is another historically important element of Swamp Thing's mythos called the Green, and I would like to explain briefly exactly what the Green actually is. The Green is an elemental force that connects all plant life on Earth. It's governed by a collective hive mind of previous elementals like Swamp Thing and other powerful plant-based heroes and villains. This collective banding of minds together is known as the Parliament of Trees. Essentially think of the Green as the Force from Star Wars, except for plants. It connects all of the plant life on Earth and is a tremendously powerful force within the DC universe. First few issues of Alan Moore's run, Swamp Thing is attacked by another historical nuisance, the Sutherland Corporation. After this attack, Swamp Thing's body is badly damaged, and in the process he learns the truth about his origins, and that he's not really actually Alec Holland. This revelation causes Swamp Thing to revert into a plant mass and essentially give up. In Swamp Thing's absence, Jason Woodrow, aka the Floronic Man, attempts to commune with the Green by eating pieces of Swamp Thing, but that process drives him insane. Floronic Man becomes an avatar of the Green and convinces the plant life on Earth to produce excess oxygen, which would kill all human and animal life on Earth. However, Swamp Thing is revived from his catatonic state by Abigail Arcane, and now out of his funk explains to the Green that if humans and animals die, so does all plant life, as they generate the majority of carbon dioxide that plants feed off of. Floronic Man loses his connection to the Green and is scooped up and imprisoned by the Justice League. The rest of the series is pretty incredible. It primarily focuses on Swamp Thing and Abigail's relationship as they fall in love and cope with one person being human and the other being a bunch of plants. Eventually in this series, Lex Luthor's able to separate Swamp Thing's body and his consciousness from the Green and destroys him with napalm. However, it is later revealed that Swamp Thing's consciousness left Earth for deep space to find a new planet, and in issue 56, titled My Blue Heaven, Swamp Thing finds a blue planet and populates it with millions of copies of Abigail and other reminders of the Earth he left behind. After Alan Moore left, the book wasn't really that good anymore, and then the next couple series also weren't that great, so I'm not really going to focus on those very much. Instead, I'm just going to kind of jump forward in time here to catch up to modern day. After the events of the Green Lantern event Blackest Night in the comic books, there's a smaller event called Brightest Day. During this event, we saw a reanimated Alec Holland turn once again into Swamp Thing. The major notable difference this time is that instead of Swamp Thing being a mass of plants that believed itself to be Alec Holland, this time it actually was Alec Holland. It's a pretty radical shift for the character. This new version of Swamp Thing was kind of made into the living embodiment of life. After the events of Flashpoint in the DC universe, we are launched into a whole new Prime universe. This Prime universe is the center point for the time period in DC Comics known as the New 52. In this time period, Swamp Thing was written by Scott Snyder and again featured Alec Holland as Swamp Thing. In his first major story arc, Rot World, Snyder focused on Alec Holland as he battles, again, Anton Arcane. The difference this time being that Anton is now an avatar of the Rot, an elemental force similar to the Green, except focused on death and decomposition. The story focused on Animal Man and Swamp Thing as they emerge a year into the future after the Rot has taken over the entire Earth, killing everyone. The Red is also featured in this storyline, the Red being an elemental force tied to animal life. The story unfolds throughout the events of both Swamp Thing and Animal Man, with each book taking a look at the narrative from that character's perspective. The story has kind of a bittersweet ending for Swamp Thing, as it ends with Abigail Arcane being made into the living avatar of the Rot and taking place of the insanely powerful Anton Arcane. This does mean that Swamp Thing and Abigail can never be together, as her simple touch causes Swamp Thing to rot and die. Swamp Thing and Animal Man are returned to the past and the future is saved. Charles Soule takes over on the book shortly thereafter, and the series builds more and more mythology into the Swamp Thing universe, including elements for machine life, and even adding more mythology for fungal life as well. Now, I've crossed over a lot of Swamp Thing history here. It would be pretty much impossible for me to break down every Swamp Thing story and piece of history, but this is some of the stuff that I found to be the best when reading the character over the years, but by no means is this meant to be a complete history of the character. And that is about it for this crash course on Swamp Thing. And if you learned a lot about Swamp Thing, then please drop us a like and a comment. Those are the two things that help YouTube's algorithm push this video to the forefront, and we would really appreciate if you guys could help us out with that. This has been Nick with Key Issues, and you know the motto: comics over everything.